Hey guys, Andrew Dowling here and Mitch Kurtz. Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Altmed podcast.
Make sure to hit like and subscribe because we've got heaps more content coming out and it's really fun and great and we love it all.
Also very good. Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Altmed podcast. My name is Andrew Dowling. With me as always, my co-host Mitch Kurtz. Looking fresh, Mitch.
Thank you.
It's a big week here in Victoria, and we have one of the stars of the show joining us on the podcast today. We're absolutely thrilled that we've been able to steal her for a short window this week in a very manic week leading up to the state election. It is none other than the leader of the Reason Party and member of the Upper House in the Victorian Parliament, Fiona Patten. Fiona, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you to both of you for the invitation. What you talk about is what I love talking about.
We appreciate it. Well, we've got so much to tackle, and we know that drug law reform is one of many pillars that that the Reason Party stands upon. But maybe if we could, just for our listeners, get a bit of your background and how you got into politics.
Yeah, I was. I think. Look, I think like lots of politicians, it's not a path that you choose. I certainly was not planning to be a politician. But I started as a fashion designer, but then I got involved around HIV and AIDS. And I got politicized around that because I saw the discrimination happening for my friends who were gay, who were contracting HIV. And at that time, I also got involved in harm reduction. So I was a volunteer on needle and syringe exchange, mobile buses, and I got involved in sex work. I initially met sex workers, then worked for a little bit myself. But then I worked for years as in an industry association representing small businesses that were being discriminated against for a range of reasons. And all of that led me to creating the Sex Party, which was created in 2010. In 2014, I was elected in Victoria. And in 2016, we quite rightly or sadly changed our name from the Sex Party to the Reason Party. And so I was elected in 2014. And yeah, as you've mentioned, I'm up for re-election now.
Well, it's a wonderful thing that you were elected to the Upper House. You've been a wonderful voice for so many Victorians. And I think just hearing your story just now, it seems that you appear to be courting topics that are stigmatized. And I just wonder whether it's, HIV, sex work, drugs, even more recently, the Lord's Prayer in Parliament. Apparently that's off limits, but maybe you can just talk to us a little bit about, what you've learned in dealing with each of those topics about stigma and about fear and how to best overcome that.
It's a great question, Andrew, and it's also a really big question. You're right. In many ways, it is those really hard topics that have taken our passion, and it's where we have advocated, and possibly it's where we've been successful. We've now in Victoria seen the full decriminalisation of sex work, and we know that as I use that as an example, because we know that the criminalisation of something is what causes the stigma in many areas. So the fact that sex work was criminalised, the fact that the use of many drugs is criminalised, that is what creates the stigma and the shame about those activities. It's not the activity itself. And when I used to speak to sex workers, they'd say, and myself, the job is easy. It's telling people what you do that's hard. And that goes across the board. Probably less so the Lord's Prayer, although that's another difficult one where, you know, we're increasingly becoming a secular nation, yet bizarrely, the Victorian Parliament, every morning we are asked to recite the Lord's Prayer as a way of starting the business of the day. And it doesn't reflect our community. And I think that's what we've been able to, I think that's what we've been able to do is, you know, try and bring the Parliament along to where the community actually is.
Yeah, I mean, if it served some sort of utility, like, for example, if I feel like anyone would be happy to recite the Lord's Prayer if it meant that someone like Bernie Finn wouldn't be cranky throughout Parliament for the day. But unfortunately, there's just no utility in it.
No.
And you're right, it doesn't reflect community standards. But I also, that point you raised about, you know, it's the fact that it's criminalized. I think as someone who is now central to our lawmaking organ in Victoria, you know, what we decipher as being right or wrong, it creates a feeling of safety for some people. People are, I suppose, you know, not prisoners, but we take some degree of comfort in being able to draw lines around acts or behaviors that we deem to be okay and those which are not. And it's, you know, telling, I think, that most people wouldn't think twice about having a drink, but we know that alcohol is a much more harmful drug than many others that we say it's not okay to. So how do you feel now about being in Parliament and being charged with the task of convincing your colleagues to redraw the lines, as it were?
I'm impatient, and I've had to learn some patience, but I am impatient. And I think when I was first elected, and I was really surprised at how long everything took, just the procedures of the Parliament, you know, the way that we would speak endlessly and repetitively about legislation. We couldn't just go, right, who agrees, who doesn't, and on we go. We would have these endless conversations that, as I say, were repetitive. So I am still frustrated by the time things take, but I am also acknowledging that we have made steps in the right direction. So we are moving, and you know, Victoria was the first state to decriminalize or to legalize medicinal cannabis and recognize it. And I was in the Parliament when that happened, and you know, seeing how you can affect change. And it's not easy, but I've been able to affect change in a range of areas. And the conversation around cannabis and around medicinal cannabis, and you know, in particular, possibly medicinal cannabis and driving, we're still not there, but we've progressed a long way. You know, we're not having the same conversations about people having bongs for breakfast and then pretending they have a prescription. You know, the community doesn't.
Sorry to jump in. Is in part due to your inquiry into the use of cannabis, not just medicinally, but in the use of cannabis in Victoria, which I think is a great document to be able to, as you would have done, share with your colleagues to actually say, well, actually, it's not people waking up and having bongs. That's a very narrow view of use in Victoria.
Absolutely. And you know, that in the end, that was a difficult inquiry to navigate, because you know, many politicians are conservative by nature. So despite the overwhelming evidence, despite the fact that the over 1,000 submissions that we received recommended that we take a pathway towards not only decriminalization but regulation of cannabis, I couldn't bring all of my colleagues with me, and so our recommendations are quite modest. Our findings are much more progressive. So, you know, in one of those funny things, the people who wanted to, you know, fight me on the recommendations didn't fight me on the findings. So the finding says cannabis should be legalized, and then the recommendation says well, maybe not now. Maybe we should think about this a bit more and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
Would you prefer to see it legalized or decriminalized?
Look, I think it's a step through process, Mitch, and it's a really good question. From a state perspective, we're dealing with our constitution, and so legalizing cannabis in Victoria, we have to pay attention to the Federal Drugs Act, but we also have to recognize that where we've seen the legalization or the regulation of it, there has been a tax component. So there's been that honey there to governments to say there's a taxation, there is a revenue that you can receive from that. And at a state level, our constitution doesn't allow us to enforce a tax. So I would like to see it regulated, and I think there are solutions to that at a state level. But first thing, let's just decriminalize it. Let's decriminalize the use and possession of drugs. Let's allow people to grow their own. I recognize that probably, much like tomatoes, the vast majority of us, while we, even if we could grow our own, won't grow our own because of our circumstances, whether that's, we've got kids or we live in an apartment that doesn't enable us to grow. So I think that's where I believe that to be completely equal, we have to provide other ways for people to be able to legally access cannabis.
I actually know a few people who being in apartments not the issue, but
No,
but it's interesting.
True. I mean, we can grow tomatoes in in apartments using very good hydroponic systems and closets and the like.
The design of the Victorian Parliament has that sort of subterranean section that was recently sort of put in. I'm just querying what's in there, but anyway.
That might have correlated with the decriminalization of all the other drugs that occurred recently as well. I'm not sure.
I think it's actually a really funny point because, cannabis was legal in Victoria. I've got this wonderful book from a Camberwell pharmacy where they registered, people who bought tinctures, indica tinctures, that bought THC tinctures. They were also selling heroin and cocaine from this chemist. But you're right, it was legal, and when the Parliament first opened, one suspects that there may have been many MPs who had access to heroin, cocaine, cannabis.
Yeah,
exactly.
It's very interesting. Well, we have access to forms of those types of things in everyday society anyway. We have opioids in hospital. You even have some forms of cocaine. I think it's an eyedropper for certain circumstances.
I don't want to know about your Friday night, Mitch. Anyway.
Yeah, in the eye. Yeah.
People would say that the cocaine available in Victoria is not really cocaine.
Yeah, it's a little bit like that. I'm actually curious. Obviously we have Tasmania that's allowing people to drive on cannabis. They were the first one. Unfortunately, we'd like to think we could have got it here in Victoria first, but the even more southerners got onto it a little quicker than us. What do you think the future does look like at the moment for that particular topic?
This is absolutely crucial, Mitch, for the future of our medicinal cannabis industry. We cannot exclude our patients from driving. It makes no sense. It makes no road safety sense. It is purely a stigma-driven thing, and it is purely an issue of fear. And you mentioned Tasmania. Well, Tasmania didn't change its laws. It just basically said, if you've got a prescription for a medication, then you have a defense to any roadside testing of that medication. And our legislation was a little bit more particular here in Victoria, and that the defense and the ability to drive while on benzodiazepines, on opioids, on histamines on anything that might make you drowsy or make you might impair you. We have that, but because of THC and because of our random drug testing and the way we wrote our legislation for random roadside drug testing, that was the problem for us. And now it's bringing that back. And it's a very simple amendment that could happen to the legislation. I think we've convinced most people that we can do it. It's just now getting the right time in the parliament for it to happen. And my initial thoughts are that, you know, we actually just do this as a trial initially, just say that if someone gets pulled over on a roadside drug test and they have a prescription for medicinal cannabis, they do not appear impaired, then there should be no offence committed. Let's start with that. And see where we go. And that's what Tasmania does. It's what New Zealand does. It's we see it in most jurisdictions don't have this problem because they've never had random roadside drug testing.
Yeah, well, no, it's a great point. And I know that there was discussion around, well, should we have an equivalent blood alcohol reading for cannabis? But obviously, as you would know, the drug stays in your system for longer. It just doesn't appear to be appropriate.
I think it gets really complicated, and it's, when you look at what we do for other medication, and we're just talking medicine. We're not talking about adult use of cannabis. We're just talking about those people who are prescribed this medicine. For every other medicine, we just say, don't drive if you're feeling drowsy or feeling impaired. That's what we say. We don't say you can't drive if you're on this medication. Medicinal cannabis is the only one where we put that prohibition on it. And I think in the first instance, that's what needs to change. If we start going down that rabbit hole of, some sort of percentage, some sort of blood alcohol or, blood ratio, it's dangerous. And as you say, it's absorbed into our system through our fats, and it's very different to alcohol in that way. And the other thing is, we can go down the impairment testing, but we're not impairment testing for people on opioids or benzodiazepines. So why would we do this for medicinal cannabis? I think initially we just should say it's a medicine, treat it like every other medicine.
Exactly.
Do you think that would still stand if we did create an adult use recreational market? Because obviously in a medicinal capacity, the assumption at least is that most people have a controlled dosage forms similar to benzodiazepines or any other type of medication you might get from a doctor. If you created an adult use recreational market, then you would see consumptions, imagine, increase beyond that. And at that point, would you say there might be a call for a blood alcohol, or let's call it a BCC kind of level, or do you think that we should still stick with it doesn't need to be tested at all?
Yeah, I kind of want to deal. In my mind is like, let's deal with that when we get to that point. And let's look at what's happening in other jurisdictions. Let's look at what's happening in Canada, and the 20 odd states in America that have this. And initially, I just want medicinal cannabis patients who are getting great relief and for the first time in their lives, sleeping well, without pain, feeling like they can get back into life. I want them to be able to drive. Once we go down that adult use, I still don't, there might be something we can do there. We know that the impairment of cannabis is pretty short-lived from a driving perspective. We know that, it's in the first 2 hours, you're probably the most impaired. And then after that, far less so. And I think up to, probably after 4 hours, you're not particularly impaired. So once we legalize it, we are going to have to rethink our roadside drug testing for sure.
Absolutely. No,
but
I think that's right.
I don't quite know what it's going to look like, Mitch. I think we'll probably get better at the testing that we do. And again, if we get better with impairment, then we might go down that path, but that's going to pick up a whole bunch of people who didn't sleep well, and pick up a whole bunch of people who,
Sure. I'm not saying it should. I'm just curious, on that point, where we kind of sit on that one.
Yeah, I think it's good. And I think, impairment's what they use in Canada. It's what they use in America, but they use the traditional walk the line, touch the toe, touch your toes, touch your nose, type of basic testing. And I'm not sure that would be a goer in Australia, because we are unique in that we've got random roadside drug testing here, and it's kind of, it's embedded in our culture.
Yeah. I also feel like we like specific numbers to judge people against. Like once you leave it up to that, it's very North American to say, oh, we'll just do what the kind of police interprets the kind of scenario to be. It doesn't feel very Australian. Like it's either you're above 0.05 or you're not, and those are the rules. You know what I mean? Yeah. That feels more Australian to me, at least. But when you start looking,
there was a recent, well, it's actually not that recent now, but in one of the magistrates' courts, there was a guy who was in there for driving under the well, he tested positive for methamphetamine. Now it appears that this fellow was a really reckless driver and was driving. He probably hadn't slept for 48 hours, as well as testing positive for methamphetamine, but the police just charged him with driving with being found with meth in his system, and the maximum offence that the courts could give him was like a 6-month license loss. And the magistrate was saying, come on, this person was absolutely impaired. They were out, they were really out of it, and the best you can do is charge them with having methamphetamine in their system. You've got so when police can start charging people for being impaired, and there's a law against it, but no one ever gets charged with being impaired. They just get charged with the presence of a drug, and because it's lazy policing. And I think if we do move towards a regulated and legal market, they're going to have to lift their game.
Absolutely. And I do think about, on this topic and others, people seem to have this idea, because I know that legalizing cannabis and decriminalizing parts of reason and parts of the Greens policies, but I'm curious about this idea that people seem to have that anyone who advocates for this cause thinks that there's going to be a single act of parliament, some magnificent omnibus bit of legislation that just is a magic silver bullet that resolves everything. And as you said earlier, patience is something that you learn when you get to parliament. Yeah. And I think you're right to talk about, drug law reform, I guess decriminalizing possession, these sorts of things. In my view anyway, I imagine that these were a sort of first priority in the order of things, because of course these are the types of policies that directly harm Victorians.
And that's right. And I'm not just talking about decriminalizing the use of cannabis. We know that 15% of all cases heard before the magistrates' court, and that's like we're talking tens of thousands of cases, are on drug possession and drug use. They're not on drug manufacturing, drug trafficking, drug distribution. They're on possession. And the vast majority of drug cases, I think about 80%, are possession charges. So it is crazy that people are receiving criminal sentences. And we know the majority of those are actually cannabis, because it's the most popular illicit drug. So yes, let's move to decriminalization immediately.
Yeah.
But let's look at a regulatory model. And I've been, looking at what are the workarounds, like how can we get around the Federal Act and how can we do that? And there are workarounds, but you're right. It's not just, let's just legalize cannabis. There's a range of other things. But I must say, I was recently in Malta, and I've been looking at how the Maltese have done it. And I think that's quite interesting that they've gone for a non-commercial form of regulation. So you don't hear people talking about big alcohol, big tobacco, big cannabis. They've done a much more of a social club approach. And I think that's, to me, that might be a way of alleviating a lot of the fears about cannabis stores opening up next to schoolyards or whatever the unrealistic fears are that people have.
I think it sounds similar to, it probably borrowed a bit from the Spanish kind of grey movement where they have the, those cannabis clubs.
It's sorry, Mitch, you're absolutely right. It is, but they've actually legislated it and regulated it. And so they decriminalized use and possession and grow. And in December this year, the first social club will get its license, and they must be not-for-profit associations. I think they can have a maximum of 500 members. They can grow for those members, but that what they grow is regulated. It will be tested. Sorry, it will be tested. It will be tested by the government. It'll be, so those sort of health and safety checks to make sure that, people are growing it in a healthy way, so it doesn't have mold and, inappropriate additives and those sorts of things. So there's a government regulation, but it's trying to get small grows for people that can't grow it themselves.
Absolutely in favor of that. And I think as well, just there is a tendency both with, this law and others that we've been touching upon, where people seem to think that if I identify one single problem with what is being proposed, the whole house of cards collapses. I was reading a paper about what the experience has been like in Canada since they legalized in 2018. And there was a research paper where the researchers were writing about how there had been an increase in cannabis poisoning of children, being anyone under the age of 18, of course. And they said this could all be fixed with appropriate warning labels on products and child-resistant closures on the containers. And it doesn't have a toxicity that causes fatality or anything that alcohol or other drugs could do. But we're just flagging that this is a problem that needs to be addressed and can be addressed. And we don't think in any way that the researchers really made the point of saying the positives of legalizing cannabis far outweigh, but then of course politicians over there will jump on that paper, and the same thing happens here. Is that part of the day-to-day challenge for you, Fiona?
You're absolutely right. It's I think one of the most common catch cries is, well, look what happens with alcohol. Why would you want to legalize another drug? And I think particularly because, and I think, I would say the Greens Party has been guilty of this. Let's treat cannabis like alcohol. Let's all agree not to say that, because, the alcohol industry, it is, has got its problems. And the way we promote alcohol, the way that we've embedded alcohol into our culture is problematic. So let's not link cannabis to alcohol. Apart from anything, cannabis is nothing like alcohol. It's a completely different product. And I think the people who say that obviously haven't used cannabis.
We talk about this regularly. There's a lot of people who try to pigeonhole it. It seems to fall in one of three categories. It either gets linked to alcohol, it gets linked to big pharma, or it gets linked to tobacco. And it's like why can't cannabis be its own industry? Why does it have to fall within the prism of within the paradigm of one of those three? And it has
the nuances that I think should compel it to have it sort of as a standalone in its own field, as do, and maybe we can just briefly touch on psilocybin medicines, because I know you've raised this in the Parliament, probably the first person in the Victorian Parliament to talk about this. How did that experience go?
It's Look, when I started talking about MDMA and psilocybin in the parliament, people do get a bit excited, particularly when you start talking about it in a positive way. And I, you know, I did a couple of weird, what would be seen as strange things, but I raised psilocybin and MDMA with the health minister, and just around increasing access to it and enabling access. And in most cases, I was actually talking about a specific patient, specific doctor, and a special access scheme. Then I changed my track and I started talking to the Minister for Veterans Affairs, and started talking to him about what if there was something on the market that could help with crippling PTSD, wouldn't he want to make that available to veterans in Victoria? And that got a different response.
Yeah.
And then, Victoria's trying to pride itself on being not trying to, I mean, it is going a long way, on being a medical research capital.
Yeah.
And, we've got a lot of good startups and a lot of good medical research happening here. So then I started speaking to the ministers relevant to that area about the opportunities that psilocybin and MDMA had here. And that has led to some funding. And we've got some really great research going on at the Brain Park at Monash University. We've got that great research going on at St. Vincent's Hospital on end-of-life anxiety with psilocybin. And weirdly, because you start talking about it in medical terms, because you're starting to talk about it in those areas, that people have been quite receptive to it. Not quite enough to, fully change the laws to make it easier for researchers and patients and doctors to access it, but certainly we're starting to see a lot more trials, and people are starting to see the opportunities of these new medications that may be able to help people particularly with mental health coming onto the market. But Mitch, I think again goes to that fear of the other side, that we don't want psilocybin, we don't want these medications to go into big pharma.
No,
So
not ideally.
And it's trying to find that balance. We don't want Johnson & Johnson owning magic mushrooms.
No,
I'm torn on that in some ways, I must say, because on the one hand, they have the ability to actually do the clinical trials that would prove their efficacy. And to be honest, if Johnson & Johnson had those types of drugs instead of other, much more harmful, and they were profitable, I feel like it might be better, the lesser of two evils in a sense. So I am torn. You never want to wish Johnson & Johnson any more financial fortune than they've had, or power. But if you could swap it out a little bit, you know what I mean? I am slightly torn on that, I would say, in some respects.
Oh, look, I mean, when I was out at Brain Park talking to them about the really terrific work they're doing out there. And they're not only doing terrific work with patients who've got high-level anxieties, they're also doing this terrific work that all of the therapists have to have a course of psilocybin. And we're not talking just, a little bit of a few magic mushrooms in your tea. We're talking full-blown, like massive doses. You are out-of-body experience kind of doses. And the therapists will go through that. So when they're treating their patients, they know what their patients are doing. And it's the first time I understand that research has been done on the effect of therapists and the doctors having experienced psilocybin and how that impacts on the therapy that they provide to their patients.
It'd be a very different landscape, I imagine, if we force doctors to have a couple of months on Lyrica just to empathize with their patients.
Yeah.
Exactly. Now there's a thought. Yeah. You've got to take it before you prescribe it.
I was just thinking as well in terms of, as a lawmaker and with your parliamentary colleagues, isn't there potentially some self-interest here if you've got to do an all-nighter to get some legislation through, like pandemic bill? I think some mushrooms would have gone down nicely on that
just to
occasion.
deal with the other people in Parliament, or maybe.
And the Fruit Loops with the gallows out the front, they weren't,
No, they're not happy people, and really, a little dose of MDMA could have actually really lightened their mood. I don't know whether it would make legislation pass more quickly, but it would pass more pleasantly.
Yes,
more fun.
Yeah, we would have. It would be a lot happier in there.
Yeah. Well, just for those in other states tuning into this, I remember that that just seemed to go all night. And there was a lot of conjecture about amendments to the state of emergency powers and this pandemic bill. I'm just curious, what time did you end up getting that one through, and did you just go home and have a big sleep?
Yeah, look, to me, that was an easy one. We did 60 hours with voluntary assisted dying. We went through the night. Then if you look at my bill on safe access zones around abortion clinics, that was an early one. We finished at 4 a.m. on that one. Then,
Is Psilocybin still open at that time? Can you wander over the road and have a glass of wine, or?
No, but fun fact, Andrew, that the library and the restaurant and the members' bar must remain open while Parliament is sitting. They cannot go home.
I love that.
You can always get a drink at Parliament if Parliament's open. And you can borrow a book as well.
If they want to fit it into the alcohol system, you must always be able to get a joint at Parliament whilst it's open.
Yeah. Is it also, just curious, does the other side or opponents of these types of legislation, is the goal sometimes in your experience that possibly, if you just wear down the other side through just torturous hours of debate, that they will give ground and won't? Is that the strategy?
It's a strategy. It's not an effective one. I've never seen it work. So I've seen them try it many times, but I've never seen it work. It's just in many ways, it's just a delaying mechanism. It's also a mechanism for people because throughout that, someone's got to be talking. So those that really love to talk, and they're opposed to it, they talk the whole way through it. They spend those hours listening to themselves, probably thinking that they're saying really brilliant things. No one is watching.
Is everyone at the bar at that point?
Yes. Well, no, not necessarily. Not me anyway. But I'll be in my office, trying to do something else.
What do you think a realistic outcome is over the next few years? We've asked this question to a few of our guests, and it seems to be that people think that CBD might be legalized first, and then potentially THC down the line. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think CBD is largely legalized now. What we're down to, it's down to a Schedule 4 medicine. We've got it at Schedule 2 over the counter for very small doses of CBD in
Schedule
product.
3.
Probably not terribly useful doses, so it's not a terribly useful product, but we've got that. I think we're at the cusp. I think we're probably 2 to 3 years away from, I think we're very close to decriminalization. I think that is, I would hope, if I'm re-elected, I would hope I would see that in the next term. It's certainly one of my priorities. I think we're getting a much more friendly federal government to enable further regulation of a cannabis industry that wouldn't that people would be able to access cannabis without a prescription. You're right. Initially CBD without a prescription, then THC products. But cannabis is quite different, and we can't use the TGA doesn't work for cannabis, particularly. The liquor licensing, those laws don't particularly work for the sale and dispensing of cannabis. So we are going to have to create new systems. However, Canada can show us the way. Colorado, New York, Washington, you name it. There's Illinois,
especially on CBD, because I can't think of another jurisdiction. Well, there's parts of Asia, I guess, but the CBD in most of the Western world is just not even, it's barely regulated. It's just whatever goes, just sell it over the counter, online, at Aldi.
A Commonwealth descheduling decision. I mean, there's always just interplay here, but we know we're very lucky to have you for so long, Fiona, and how busy you are. But I think just touching on that vision of the next term, we might just one final question ask you about what else is on the, I guess, the policy agenda for the Reason Party for the next term.
Yeah, thank you. Look, certainly drug law reform, absolutely. But I think there's also a lot of justice issues that need to be reformed. We are building prisons instead of houses. We are locking people up because they're homeless, because they have mental health issues. So certainly changing the way our justice system works and looking to the evidence to make that work more effectively. So drug law reform is very much part of that. Housing is very much part of that. I'm really worried around women's reproductive rights, that we've seen Roe versus Wade in America. We've seen that go backwards. We're seeing really conservative politicians being pre-selected in the Liberal Party, but also in Labor. So I think we are going to have to remain very alert to changes to reproductive health rights, and we need to move forward. There's a lot more we need to do on that. And the other area that I am particularly passionate about is a separation of church and state, and really trying to tease out the power that religious organizations have within government, but more importantly, the privilege that they have, whether that's tax-free status for businesses that make a lot of money, chaplaincy programs in schools, when really we need mental health care workers in schools, not chaplains. And so I've got a few.
Totally agree. I mean, arguably that they were quite instrumental in the reason that it wasn't those types of groups. It wasn't legalized in New Zealand more recently. That kind of Christian love, and the types that would make you say the Lord's Prayer before engaging.
And the one final thing would be looking at logging, looking at our climate, and obviously, the role that hemp can play in that.
Totally.
And that probably goes also to our expansion of CBD, because we know we can extract some pretty good CBD from hemp.
Absolutely.
I often find this when I, listen to you or look at the party's policies, but all entirely sensible and very much would represent a step in the right direction for Victoria. So fully support all of your efforts and the efforts of your candidates at the upcoming election. And we'll see what happens on Saturday. We will, of course, expedite getting this one out before Saturday. So we should have this released in the next 24 hours to put this in the ether and hope that we get a few bites before the election.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. It's been a really great conversation.
Thank
we
you.
appreciate your time.
Thanks so much, and good luck on Saturday.
Thank you.
Thanks, Fiona.
Thanks.
See ya.
Bye.